Hello everybody, this is Michael Navjalal from the interwebs. So today we're going to be talking about doing a simple introduction to JavaScript, just to get everyone on the same page. So JavaScript is the web language that allows us to create scripts that make our web pages interactive. So to start with, I'm going to be using this tool called CodeSandbox.io, and what it lets us do is it just lets us create a very simple web project with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that lets us basically experiment with different web attributes, right? So it's completely front end, which means that it is only gonna be able to run inside your web browser, and it won't be able to like save data to like a database yet, right? Because it's not connected to a server or anything like that. So the first thing we're gonna start with is we're gonna talk about the key aspects of JavaScript that you should know to get started with programming JavaScript projects. So I'm going to list them out on this left side right here. So I'm just using a simple multi-line comment, and I'll maybe talk about that later in this video, but I'm going to try to keep it short for now, since this is like the first one and we're just trying to feel things out. So for most in general programming languages, you'll have your input and output. So how will you modify or update the contents, or like get input, get out, and return out output. Then you have functions, you have variables, then you have loops, specifically for loops and while loops. And then you'll have different sort of data types, right? And it's like the stuff I can think of off the top of my head, and then if I can think of anything else, I'll make sure to add on to that if I remember it. So the first thing that we'll talk about is different ways of dealing with input and output. So a good example is, like, say we want to do a simple program where we ask the user what their favorite color is, right? And then maybe later on we'll use that in for something else, right? So the first thing we need to figure out is, like, okay, say we don't know how to modify the web contents or the HTML or whatever, or the web page itself. How do we just prompt the user for something, right? So the first thing is we would use this prompt. Well, we'll get to that later, because that shifts in. Well, yeah, we can talk about that and then talk about how you would return something out. So to prompt the user for some input, right, and then we'll talk about how we would save that input later, you would use this prompt function, right? I see it already prompted something. So we'll do something like, what is your favorite color? Right, now it just made a little prompt for us, and then we can type in a color here, right? And I'll keep doing it until, it'll do it every single time as the page loads. And obviously, since it's and we'll talk about the format of this a little bit here, right? So okay. I'm gonna turn off the preview for now. So what you want to know is that when it comes to just general like functions and input in JavaScript, it's kind of similar to like if you ever programmed like C or C++ or something like that, but a lot of programming languages will kind of sort of have this format, but you'll usually have the name of the function, and then like a left parenthesis, a right parenthesis, and then sort of data that you're using. In this case, we're using a string, right, which is basically a bunch of text that we have wrapped around quotation marks, and that's basically how we like deal with using text and like letters and words inside of a like the context of a programming language, right? So this is like a simple way you would pull information from the user, or one method of doing it. And then the method to push things out back to the user would be using something like alert, right? And this would visibly send out a message to the user, right? So if I refresh the page, so it prompted me, and then I get an alert, right? And another thing is like now different JavaScript, different web browsers are more or less strict depending on this, but you'll see that there's a semicolon, right? So a semicolon is supposed to like tell that the interpreter or whatever is processing the script, like you've hit the end of like a single expression, right? Different web browsers might process it differently, but it's a good practice to always end expression with a semicolon, right? So here we have our basic method of getting input and our method of getting output, right? So whenever you have an input, you want to save that input somehow so you can actually work with it, right? And that's where variables comes in, right? So say I want to save a variable, or save the information, save something that basically holds on to the color, like what the user's favorite color is, right? We would have to create a variable for that. So to create a variable in JavaScript, you would use this. Give it a second. To create a variable, you start with a var, which stands for like let's create a new variable, and then you would give it the variable name. In this case, it's going to be color, right? For now, I'm going to ignore this prompt and alert thing, and we're going to save the color to be red, right? So now, if we do alert color, and notice how this color variable is not inside of quotation marks, right? To reference a variable, right, you want to reference it without any quotation marks, and this tells the computer that, hey, I'm not talking about like the word color, I'm talking about a variable called color, right? And then what the computer will do is it'll search throughout your program for that color variable, right? And then it will replace the color reference that you had with the value of color inside the color. In this case, it will replace it with red, right? So essentially, to the computer, right, what it's going to do when it sees this, it's going to evaluate color, right? And then this is going to turn into alert red, and then this is what's the final thing that's being run and sent over, right? So that's basically how you would store a variable, right? And this would be considered a global variable. And this is because it has a var keyword. So now, why do I call it global variable? Because there's also these things called local variables, right? So local variable would be something that's within a different scope compared to this variable, right? So you could change scopes using curly braces, right? So any code block is considered to be in its own scope, and that's when you can like create local variables. So like, right? So you'll see, right? So I created this color too, right? Let's see. Can I do this? What's this issue? Yeah. Okay. So right now you see how I have two color variables, right? And the reason why this is possible is because we have a global scope and then we have a local scope, right? So, and the way that you would switch between the two is by using var or color. So var or let. So var always says, hey, this is a global variable. This can be used anywhere else inside of our script, right? Let says, hey, this is a local variable. You can only use it inside of this, specific context, whether it's a function, a loop, an if statement, whatever. Anything that you would group within a block, then you're saying, hey, you're only using this variable relative to this block, right? If I were to do var color, right, now it's like, well, hey, now you're trying to declare the same variable twice, because now it knows, like, hey, we already have a global variable called color, which we declared here, right? So that would work too, right? So this is, like, when I did this, now it knew, oh, you're referring to this global color, not the local color that we created, right? So if I did the color here, right, so this we're basically saying, when we did this, we're basically saying, hey, this color, not like local, whatever, right? But either way, best rule of thumb is to always basically kind of like differentiate those variables, right? So there's that. I'm gonna change it to this. Okay. So once you have variables, right? And variables don't have to specifically be strings, and I'll discuss that next, right? So once you have variables, you can start handling different sort of data types, right? So let's create a bunch of different data types, and then I'll talk about it a little bit. Well, these are like the main ones. You'll usually, usually boils down to you have either text, so you either have strings, integers, which are positive or negative, like whole numbers including a 0, and you have floating point numbers, right? So that means it's like a decimal or something, basically, right? And then you can nest it, so you can basically have the variable store like expression, right? So you can do a mathematical operation like 2 divided by 10, right? And then this would evaluate to 0.2, right? So if I were to alert out D, we get 0.2, right? It didn't store the expression 2 divided by 10. It stored the result of that expression, right? So those are like what you technically, that's what you get to work with, right? And then you can do all sorts of arithmetic operations, whatever you want on it, right? So there's that. So we covered this, this. Now we'll talk about functions, right? So functions is really going to be like the way you kind of handle complexity in your program, right? You can have a 10,000 line program and you could like repeat steps over and over again. But the best way you make your code reusable and save time like developing your program is through the use of functions, right? So say like I have a pet function, like a function that lets you pet animals, right? That takes in an animal and it says, you just pet the animal Serenity or something, right? That's a general purpose function that you can use on different animals with different names, right? So I'll show you a basic example of how you would code that up, right? So to create a function similar to like the alert function or the prompt function that we used previously, to create a function like that, you start by using the function keyword. So we say function, right? And then we do the name of the we say what the name of the function is. So in this case, we're going to do pet animal, right? And then you're going to do parentheses, and then you're going to list out like what the inputs are going to be, right? So in this case, we're going to want the name of the animal, and that'll be all for now, right? So once you do that, that's like your prototype, right? But well, that's like the basic. That's you're giving it the name and what its inputs are, right? Then you have to say like what. Right? Then you have to say what the function does, right? And that's where you create curly braces and you put that afterwards, right? So this is saying like, hey, this is the list of like code. This is the block of code that this function will run with the given input that you gave it, right? So this given input's a local variable, right? There could be a global variable named name, but it's not the same as the name that you passed, right? This name variable will be only used for this specific call to the function, right? And I'll show you kind of what that means later on, right? So we're gonna use that alert function that I showed you previously with some basic string concatenation, and we'll use that to create a petting function, and you'll see how it goes, right? And then I can show you how we would call this function multiple times, right? So you petted, and then plus name, right? And then because they liked it, right? So, and this is our generic function. Later on, you know, if we want to get more specific, then we could add a gender input, we can add species input, stuff like that, right? But now, when other programmers who use that function, all they have to know is that you have a pet animal function, it takes in a name, they don't need to know what the function does, right? To them, it just looks like this, right? They don't know what code's being run inside of it, they just know they have this wonderful function called pet animal, and it'll pet the animal for them, right? So, if we just call pet animal, and let's do Serenity, right? Then it'll say you petted Serenity. That's pretty dope, right? And it says they liked it, right? So now we can add other names, like so we pet that animal, but let's also pet Shadow. Right. Now we just petted 2 animals, right? So that's a simple example of how we would use a function, right? So that's like your base case. If you wanted to have multiple parameters, then you would just say actually I'm going to change this and I'll show you why. There's another output function called console log that's less annoying. That's what I'm going to use right now. And if you're also using Sandbox, what will happen is that you can click on this little console window down here, and it'll just say console, right? And it'll show you the outputs in the console right down here, which will be just better for testing purposes, right? So let's say instead of just the name, we also want the species, right? So we can say you petted, and then Shadow the cat, or something that whatever, right? So and then species, right? So now we just use 2 variables, and you can just list off as many variables you know you're going to use in the function, right? So now instead of just you petted Serenity, now it says you petted Serenity the cat, right? Or you petted Shadow the cat. But then you can change it to like dog, right? Now it says you petted Shadow the dog instead. So functions are really useful when you have like behavior that you know you can repeat, but then you have like X, Y, and Z, or however many attributes of that function that you want, like like change a little bit. It's like you have a bunch of like dials in like on an oven, right? You can do so many different things on an oven, right? But the base behavior of the oven stays relatively the same, right? So now that we covered that, I can talk very briefly about loops, and then we can end the video there, right? So there's two types of loops inside of JavaScript. There are for loops and while loops. A while loop is basically where you say while and then some sort of condition, like while the sky is blue, or this, the day is, or the time is between like the 6 a.m. and 10 a.m., right? And then while that's the case, then like you run some piece of code, right? So we can say while, you can create like a time variable, let's say, you know, it's like 12 o'clock, right? And then we can, and I'll show you what we'll do with this time thing very soon, right? So, also another thing to note is when you have a variable, after you declare it once, when you want to update it, you just say the name of the variable and then like what's the new value, right? I forgot to say that, but I'm saying it now. So we can say while the time is less than, while the time, let's say it's 1 o'clock, right? While the time is less than or equal to 9 o'clock, right? Then we can say, we can just do two things. We can say console log, the time is time, let's do PM, let's refresh this. So the issue with loops is that you can accidentally get into a forever loop, which is not fun. Which I think I just got into. Let's give it a second. Yeah, I had a feeling that was going to happen. So that's kind of like the only bad thing about loops, is that you can lose a lot. You can accidentally crash your web browser if you're not careful. We recovered it, right? So while the time while false, let's do that. So while the time, so it's time equals time plus 1. Initially time is equal to 1. While time is less than 10. Right? So then we can say start at 6, and let's do 10 p.m. So now we have it where we have this like pseudo clock, very similar to Animal Crossing, where they have their own virtual clock. So we started the time at 6, right? Let me just flip it around. And now we say we have some announcer, right, who wants to say what the time is every single time we like increment the virtual clock, right? So at first he's like, it's 6 p.m., then 7 p.m., then 8 p.m., 9 p.m., and then we end the clock, and then now it's greater than or equal to 10, and then we say now it's time for bed. So that's a small example of a while loop. Now we can also write the same thing inside of a for loop, and that the process is a little bit different. So for a for loop, you're gonna have, move this, it's called T. So for a for loop, you're gonna have initializer. It goes to initializer, right? So var T. Then you have a check statement, so like a comparison statement. So is it like some condition, like is it T less than whatever, and then you have some assignment statement or some expression you're gonna run, like at the end of the loop. So in this case, we're gonna increment the time variable. So T equals T plus 1, right? Then we can just do the same stuff as last time, except we don't need that increment statement at the very end, right? See, and it did the same thing, right? Now the main thing to note is for the while loop or for the for loop, what you have in that center conditional statement does not have to be like, is T less than 10 or whatever. It could be like, it could be a loop that keeps going or keeps incrementing it could keep track of multiple variables, or like it could be X, Y, and Z, or it could be like a color, or like the state of some sort of decaying particle. It could be anything basically. So that's kind of my like general super fast like rundown of JavaScript. If you have any questions, you can comment below on YouTube or send me a message somehow, and I'll get back to you before the photons leave the screen or some crazy thing. But that's all for now. I hope you guys enjoyed the episode, and see you next time.